Okay, we are live.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. I wish I had a Guinness, but instead I'm just swigging Irish tea. Attaboy. And Peter and I agreed earlier we'd each try to wear green. His green is a different shade than my darker green. God, Jade. So nobody pinched you all day, right, Peter?
That's right. I don't know that tradition. I think when I grew up, St. Patrick's Day wasn't as big a deal as it seems to have gone kind of crazy. Like young people love St. Patrick's Day, but I think it's just it's a drinking holiday now. But
well,
yeah.
You know what? It's the spring version of Halloween. We just did a talk with an author writing an Irish series right before you, and we were talking about whether people in Ireland celebrate St. Patrick's Day with as much enthusiasm as in this country. And she said, it's becoming bigger. And I think a lot of it, if you think about like the San Diego Comic-Con, where people really like costumes and cosplay, Halloween is spread around the world as a chance for people to do that. And I think St. Patrick's Day is coming into that.
I think you're absolutely right. I've never heard that expression, but it's springtime Halloween. It involves getting dressed up because it's not just green anymore. It's like green ears and green fun stuff and green fishnet stockings, and it's become a big party day. Like Halloween, I mean, growing up, Halloween was a huge day when you were a kid, but adults didn't celebrate Halloween when I was a kid. I don't remember.
No, I agree with you. It was a children's thing. And in those days, as a kid, it seemed perfectly safe to go around your neighborhood with your little bag and your funny costume, and people gave you real candy, and nobody worried about razor blades in the chocolate or serial killers, kidnapping you off the backyard. It was all a different world.
Yeah, it was different too. But yeah, now I think it's become a big, a big holiday for young adults, and costume parties and all those sort of things. And now I think it's all over the world, right?
It truly is. We actually close early on Halloween at the store because downtown Scottsdale, which is lots of restaurants and bars, goes crazy. And so all of our staff want to bail out by 5 o'clock and, get out of it. And then I don't see as many kids in the neighborhoods as I remember when I was young. Many of them, for safety reasons, seem to go to Halloween parties where the candy is vetted and so forth. But I had this really wild and wonderful experience this Halloween. We have the puppies because we have new puppies locked up because they don't take kindly to the doorbell ringing. And we got to 7, and I said to my husband, we could turn off the light and maybe have dinner now and let the dogs out and so forth. Just then the doorbell rang. So I picked up this big thing of candy and I went and opened the door, and there were a whole bunch of teenagers all in costume. And I held out the candy and they looked at me and they said, "It's the poison pen." And I went,
really?
And they said, "We love your store." They said, "We hang out there." And I went, okay. And then the question was, here's the interesting question for this group. I have never been there when they have been there. So how did they recognize me? And
Internet.
Well, I think, no, what I think it is true is that they watch these programs.
Oh, okay.
Because we're coming up on 700 of these. And I think that's the only explanation that makes any sense, is that they have, and I think that's so hopeful in the sense that, we're seeing lots of teen readers. They're buying books, they're evidently watching programs and all. And, there's all this conversation about reading is for older audiences and the whole bit, but I think kids are coming on strong.
I think there's great books for young adults now. I mean, there always has been, but then we had this sort of, Harry Potter was huge because that brought reading to this whole generation. But in general, the young adult, and they're sophisticated, a lot of the young adults, like there are young adult serial killer novels and things like that, like quite, dark young adult books. I'm talking like I know what I'm talking about. I don't actually know these books, but I know they exist. Right. And that, fans, these teens who read them, go online and they discuss them with one another, and they're fans, and I think they look at videos, but they're also reading. And I think there's like a ton of good content out there for young readers. So
I do
it's
too.
hopeful.
You know, one of the questions we ask ourselves is who's going to be our live audience? We started back doing live events,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure because we had so many people who routinely came to our events, and I don't know what's happened to so many of them, and I don't know who the new people will be, and I don't
Yeah.
know if they will maybe be a younger audience in large part. It's going to be really interesting since we're moving back in that direction along with streaming. The other fun thing is we just had Tony from Romania join us again, is that we are getting questions from all over the world watching these programs. We had Mongolia for the first time a couple of weeks ago, but we have like regular fans now in Romania, Zimbabwe, and New Zealand. And, I
Wow.
love that it's spreading on an international basis.
It's great.
It is. So here's one thing I learned about Peter when I was looking for a photo to put into our e-news to advertise the fact that Peter and I were going to have this conversation. One of the photos was taken from GQ, but I think it was a British one. So here's Peter. Are you a sex symbol as well as an author, kiddo?
If I am, no one has told me that. And no, I did. What did I do? I wrote a piece for British GQ. I don't think I pitched it to him. I think my publicist in the UK came up with this idea. It was about crime fiction novels, inspiring real life crime. And so I sort of wrote about that. There are a few examples, you might know them. And I wasn't entirely prepared to talk about this, but famously Agatha Christie, and I can't remember the book, but there's a book where she's very specific about the poison that's used. And then a year later, someone used that exact poison and killed someone in his family and said he got the idea from her book. And then the other famous cases, Stephen King has a number of them. His very first novel, Rage, which is about a school shooting, actually directly inspired someone who went into a school and shot some people and had the book, and actually caused them to take that book off the shelf for a number of years. So I wrote this article for GQ. It was a really interesting topic. Trust me, they did not hire me to write this because of anything that's going on here. It was about my knowledge of crime fiction.
I love it. And Peter is actually younger than my youngest child. So I thought, he really could be GQ sexy guy. I will mention too, that among Peter's various accolades and awards, he's been a nominee for the British Ian Fleming Steel Dagger, which is the award they give for best thriller of the year. So that was exciting. Which book was that for, Peter?
That was for The Kind Worth Killing. And I actually went over for the award ceremony, which was fun. I met J.K. Rowling, who was, I can't say, when I say met, we kind of chatted briefly. We were in line together to do a sort of quick video thing. And she was very small and she had bodyguards with her. So at this point in her career, she was already, I think maybe the second richest woman in the UK after the Queen, or maybe the richest, I don't know. So I went to that award ceremony and it was fun, even though I didn't win.
Well, yeah, I think the British do really not. Where did they have it? Because I've been to many of them, especially the Diamond Dagger things. I once actually represented Scribner for one of their authors at the Diamond Dagger thing. The editor and I went together because we're friends. We were friends. And
I don't remember where it was. It was, they had hired out what felt like a sort of a restaurant or event space in London. And I couldn't tell you exactly what it was, but I can tell you who the MC was, and maybe you know him, which is Barry Forshaw.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of him or met him?
I know Barry, and he's a terrific critic. He's a very prominent British critic of literature and so forth.
Yeah, he writes for The Observer.
All right, Patrick has sent a note. I love this because he uses the chat function. He would like to tell you that the Agatha Christie book that you referenced is called The Pale Horse.
That's right, The Pale Horse. So, and that sort of went on to become this big thing. And I remember in my research that I mean, Agatha Christie was quite taken aback, which I understand. I mean, I don't personally, I don't think it's your fault. I think writers and storytellers should be able to tell the stories they want to tell. And if those are dark stories and someone wants to copy those, that's not their responsibility. That said, I imagine it would feel not great to know that someone used your book as a method for an actual crime. Could not have
Well,
been.
she didn't originate the poison. Agatha Christie, actually, her role in the war was working in a farm dispensary. So she has a history of working with medicines and poisons in the same way that Ellis Peters did the same thing in war service. And in her medieval mysteries, poison was a fairly popular way to kill people. And, there wasn't a lot of forensic testing and so forth. So you could often be more successful wiping out your victim with poison back then than if you use some bloody weapon like a dagger or a gun or something. But it's interesting that several crime writers have backgrounds in poisoning. And then hilarious, Dorothy Sayers, the only time she ever really did that was, I'm trying to remember, Patrick, you can say me again, I can't remember which book it is, but she has somebody who dies by mushroom poisoning, but she got the wrong mushroom.
She did.
And she never quite lived that down, that, here was her foray into poisoning, but she got it wrong. So maybe she saved a life somewhere by using the wrong mushroom. Maybe somebody tried to imitate her.
Right, maybe she saved a life. That's so interesting. Yeah, I think poisoning is probably Agatha Christie's most common means of dispatch in her novels, for sure.
Well, in a way, I wouldn't call her a cozy writer because she could be formidable. Thank you. The documents in the case, Patrick saves me again. The documents in the case, if you read it, I think in the modern editions of the Dorothy Sayers book, they do mention the fact that the poison or the mushroom thing is wrong. But anyway, Agatha Christie often used poison because it wasn't gory and horrible on the page. It wasn't didn't offend her readers by like disemboweling or whatever ghastly thing she could have done. So I like that. Speaking of Agatha Christie seems to have had some influence on your recent work. And oftentimes in this new book, which is one we're talking about, called 9 Lives, and I will mention that Peter has in his possession our copies, which he is going to sign.
Here's one of them.
There it is, going to sign and ship to us. So I want to be sure you know that you have plenty of time to order a signed copy of 9 Lives. And by the way, let me also say that I think the cover is very dramatic, Peter, with the yellow, which is not a cover color you see all that often. Did you have anything to do with the design?
Sorry?
Did you have anything to do other than smiling at the picture?
I smiled at the, I generally with cover designs, it's, and I'm sure this, authors don't have a lot of say. Maybe some do. I certainly don't. I think the only say that I would have is if I absolutely did not or hated a cover, my editor would say, well, I don't want to put out a book where you dislike the cover. But in general, by the time they send it to me, it's always been approved by the sales force at William Morrow and HarperCollins. And I mean, this is, covers are about sales. I mean, covers are in the domain of the sales team. So if they've already approved it, it means they think they can sell it with that cover. So they're really just looking for you to green stamp it. And I think it would be the rare occasion, like if something was just I really didn't like it, I would say something and they might tweak it.
Sure. Well, increasingly covers are not pictorial, but rather have designed with type and so forth. And in this particular book, it would be extremely difficult, I think, to come up with a pictorial representation of the plot. So,
I'll show you. This is the only thing that I think they could have done, and this is a lot more graphic, but this is the UK cover. And as you can see, and this is actually the galley of the UK, so that it actually has a real, this is showing a real envelope there. Now the actual book from the UK. It does not. This is just the galley edition, so the early one. But this is what it looks like. It's you know, an envelope, because it's got the list. So I like that one as well. I think that's the only thing you could have done in terms of a single image is maybe, you know, the envelope or the list itself.
Well, this leads me to talk about the interior design of this book, which is actually an integral part of reading this book. And because it is structured with several victims, each section of the book, it counts down. So we're moving towards one. And this is the page for number 7. And you can see there's a list of the people on the murderers list. And then each one of these sections, Peter advances the story towards his inevitable conclusion. Now, you know, most people are talking about Agatha Christie and then they were none. But I think, I'm not going to mention which one because it's a spoiler, but I think there's another Christie novel in play here. Do you find that, you know, because she was so great at plots and because you like intricate plots, that you take inspiration from her?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe, you know, she's hugely influential to me, and I read her quite young. Like I think most mystery readers and mystery writers will have a story that they were introduced to Agatha Christie quite young. She's very readable for young adults, and I think, and in particular, so I liked her books, and in particular, I loved And Then There Were None because I think it was the creepiest of her stories. Certainly the most bloodthirsty of her books, because it, you know, it puts these 10 strangers on an island, and then just one by one they get eliminated, and then it has this sort of great moment at the end where it goes back and sort of explains and tells you what happened. So I've always been influenced by that, and yeah, I mean, to me, she is simply the best plotter ever of crime novels. That was her gift, coming up with really, really clever plot ideas and really good sort of tricky murder scenarios. She did a lot with, like, all the witnesses think they're seeing one thing and in fact they're seeing something else. She was great at that stuff. So to the point where it's actually a little annoying. It's like she came up with all the really clever, she came up with really great ideas that you're like, oh, I kind of, you know, I don't want to go through them, but I think we kind of know that they're ideas that you can explain in a single sentence, very clever. So I've done a couple homages to sort of golden age mystery novels. This is one of them. And one of the things that I like to do when I'm doing an homage is talk about the book that I'm sort of paying my homage to. So in this case, several people in this book actually talk about Agatha Christie. They talk about And Then There Were None. And it's a way for me to sort of bring in that old story. It's also a way for me to acknowledge and say, yeah, I know this is a similar story, with I think a big twist, because they're not on an island. They're not isolated at all. But you know, I like to pay tribute to the previous people, and also it kind of, otherwise people will be like, oh, he's just copying it, you know. But if you put in Agatha Christie and talk about her, then it's it's an homage. So,
and it becomes better like plagiarism. It becomes an homage. Really, yeah. That's very true. And when I wrote it up, I did say that you know, if we were comparing it to And Then They Were None, which was called The 10 Little Indians, before they had a title I won't repeat at the moment, because the title has evolved as our culture has changed. That instead of on an island, you've, you know, spread it out geographically, which is more of a challenge. But, you know, in the end, in order to write this kind of a book, when everybody dies or may die, you have to come up with some way of explaining to the reader what actually happened. And, you know, and so you do end up doing that. And I don't think you can escape that if you're going to use this particular structure, but I thought it was quite clever the way you did it. Did you have to really work on, you know, coming up with a solution to letting the reader know what the crime is, but not spoiling it until we get to the very end?
Yeah, I mean, when I finally decided to write this type of story, and I think what cracked it for me in a way was because I wanted to tell this type of story. And when I realized, like, oh, maybe they don't have to be geographically together, they can be apart, and they can be isolated by this letter, that kind of allowed me a way into the story and a way to do it differently. But then before I started, of course, I was like, there has to be a reason why this is being done. And there has to be some sort of connection between these strangers. And that's actually one of the mysteries of the book, which is, and there's several mysteries, most importantly, who's doing it, why are they doing it? But also, what is the connection between these 9 people who don't feel like there's any connection between them? So I like that kind of mystery. And I thought, yeah, you have to, I had to know in advance. It wasn't one of these ones where I started writing and I didn't know who the killer was yet. I had to know in advance why it was being done and who was doing it. So I came up with that, and then went from there. And then I kind of made stuff up as I went along, the way I always kind of do. But in general, I did have a clear idea. I did think, you know, I don't know if you remember a book by Muriel Spark called Memento Mori. It's not really a mystery novel, although it's mysterious. It's much more of a philosophical novel. And in that book, a bunch of elderly people all received the same phone call, which is a disembodied voice saying, "You remember, you will die," which is Memento Mori. And then they go on to die, not necessarily by a murderer, but it's this very, and they never, you know, she never tells you who did the phone call. There's no explanation. It's just this sort of mysterious thing. And I thought, if I do that with my book, people will absolutely hate me, because I mean, I think people want, there's an expectation in this type of novel that you got to explain, you know, why it's happening. You can't have them all suddenly dying, you know, you don't tell anyone. So Muriel Spark got away with it, but I would not have.
Well, you have to come up with a device, you know, for doing that, which requires some preparation. You know, it's an interesting thing, because you're right. There are very few plots that haven't been done by Christie, and then, you know, other people have done a variation of them. And I mean, for example, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is one of the very first unreliable narrators. I mean, we all go, oh, look, it's Bond Girl and Gillian Flynn, but actually it was Agatha Christie with The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And then they were none, in a way, as an antithesis of the ABC murders. And I won't go into it, because if you've never read it, I don't want to spoil it for you. But John Sanford actually wrote a book about Virgil, Flowers, one of my, you know, Lucas Davenport and Virgil. Now Letty coming up right here on April 12th, Letty Davenport, which I think will be great. But John basically took the ABC murders and used them in the Virgil book. He screwed it up. And I wrote to him and I said, John, it doesn't work quite that way, you know? I mean, he said, oh shit. And then he said, but I'd have to rewrite the whole book, you know, in order to make it come out that way. So, you know, her influence is vast, is what I'm saying. There are so many writers who have either intentionally or just because they want to write that kind of a book, come up with a basically Agatha Christie structure, or she did it first.
Well, she's considered quite traditional. Of course, she was traditional. But she also broke a number of rules. And, you know, when Roger Ackroyd came out, there were a number of critics who were livid about that book, because she broke cardinal rules of this sort of fair play detective novel. And people were like, that wasn't fair, because we weren't given all the information by the narrator that we were supposed, you know, we're supposed to be given the same information that the detective was giving, all these rules. So she was great at breaking rules, actually. You know, she did it quite a bit. And even I think toward the end of her career, what's the 1970s one? Endless Night, maybe? Endless Night is quite a dark psychological thriller. I mean, she just sort of introduced a lot of stuff that's now kind of commonplace in the genre throughout her whole career. So I think she doesn't get enough credit for being experimental in that way.
She was tremendously experimental. When Scott Turow, we launched his last book I guess it was May 2 years ago. And I pointed out to him that Presumed Innocent was also an unreliable narrator novel. I used to have people argue with me at the checkout counter in the store because it was a very big book back then, 1989 and so forth. And people would argue about who did it, and obviously didn't even agree. So successful was Scott with that particular book. But I pointed out to him that Agatha Christie had, broken ground with the same kind of a thing. And again, he got criticized, despite the fact that it was a bestseller. He got criticized for the fact that oftentimes people couldn't figure it out. Was that really fair play?
Right, was it fair play?
But today, that whole genre has really taken off, and people like the fact that it isn't fair play. And, they're all braced for the twist, however it goes. So tell us the setup for 9 Lives, as much as you think you can reveal.
Yeah, I think we've talked about it to a certain degree, but just, in the opening part, which is titled 9, because there are 9 characters in the book, or these nine characters that don't know one another all receive the same letter, and the letter is simply a list of names, theirs being on it. They all have different reactions to this when they first get it. Some are more curious than others, some just throw it out, some get a weird premonition, but one by one they begin to die. And this becomes this sort of almost like a race against time. There's sort of detective characters that are trying to contact everyone on the list, set up protection for them, and they're trying to figure out, who might be doing this and why. But what I was primarily interested in, more than the sort of FBI element, and there is that element, was the characters themselves and how do they react to being put in this situation. And I was also really interested in this idea of, what order do these murders occur? Can I play around with the idea? I think we always have assumptions when we see this type of murder mystery about who's going to go first, who's going to survive, who done it. I was trying really hard all along the way to try and mess with those assumptions. So that's the basic premise. And it does go down. Each part is a reduction of the people, so we get that number that represents that, which was sort of my way of doing the figurines on the table, and then there were none that sit there and get broken one by one or disappear. I can't remember, but that was my version of that,
which I think is very well done. And that's why I pointed out that the design of the book really works, because each time, one person dies, then we move to a new section and a new number. And, I think an interesting question, and you raised it at one point, there is a character that the person behind the plot thinks, I should have killed this one earlier before any pattern emerged, because I probably could have brought it off better. And so you do, how do people react when they get what they think is the death sentence? At the beginning, it doesn't feel real, like it feels like a joke. So you kind of shrug it off, and then you die. But if you're like number 4, and that other people have died, then it's got to be a lot more frightening to get this thing and think, here I am, and is it really going to happen to me? So did you order them in terms of their character in any particular? You had a choice. You started out with these people, but you had a choice in the way that you knock them off, one by one. Did you have any reason to make one number 8 as opposed to number 3?
Well, I did. There was one point at which I feel like one of the characters might have been emerging as maybe more important than some of the others. And if I felt that happening, I sort of took that character out, because I was like, was trying to go against what people are expected. But I also, and I do think this is a good strategy as a crime writer. When I'm plotting my book, when I'm writing my book, and I get stuck, or I feel like things are slowing down, or I feel like I'm losing the thread, I always ask myself, what is the villain doing right now? Or what is the killer doing? Now, I even do that in a story where we haven't been introduced to the killer, or we're not seeing them on a regular basis, because ultimately they are the drivers of mystery stories. They are making things happen, even if we're not seeing them do it. And sometimes we do see them do it. So I always think, so in that case, I was trying to think like my killer, like what would be the best order to kill off this group of people? Like you said, he or she feels like they messed up at some point. But yeah, so I was always trying to get into that headspace to try and figure out what would happen next, which I think is a good strategy that I use. Yeah, think like your killer, and your book will be a lot easier.
You clearly like structure. I mean, 8 Perfect Murders, a couple books back, is another example. You like, numbers and titles are interesting too. I wonder what signals there are to 8 Perfect Murders. What if it
I
were
blew
like
them
4
because
Perfect Murders?
it's funny because this is 9 Lives. It's actually my 8th book. It would have been really nice if my 9th book had been called 9 Lives, but we can't have everything. And 8 Perfect Murders, I think, was my 6th book, so that didn't work out either.
Well, that's your fault. You
Yeah, it's my fault.
It is. You could have
Exactly.
arranged it.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention too, without giving anything away, that towards the end of the book, we talked about Agatha Christie, but our character has a chance to go into a library, and you had a good time reviewing a lot of fiction. So you point out that there is lots of Mishner and Leon Uris. I mean, those are authors that were huge in their day, but are not as familiar to us now. A whole row of Catherine Cookson books. Again, an author who was, I think did she write historicals, kind of women's fiction historical set in Britain?
Did, and my grandmother read all her books. So I kind of thought of my grandmother when I put those books in.
Yeah, it was like the poor mill girl, who married well or something of the sort.
Yeah.
She was quite big on that sort of thing. I've read quite a few of them. And then something a little more modern. There were quite a few John Grisham novels and a ton of Stephen King hardcovers. He moved on from fiction into history, then biography. There was a large section of paperback novels, mostly thrillers and romances. In the Ross McDonald section, love that. He spotted a paperback called The Drowning Pool and pulled it out. Flipped through the pages. The guy's looking for some kind of a clue in the pages of the book. Then he thought of Agatha Christie. I will leave it there. But I like the way that you brought other authors into the story, which I thought kind of enhanced the whole Agatha Christie concept, but didn't give her any competition.
Yeah, I've done that in a few books where I like. It's partly that I'm a book lover, and I love, as much as I like to read contemporary books, when I'm left with my own reading choices, I tend to dip back into the back catalogs, go back to the books that I've missed by some of my favorite writers. That's what I really love to read. So I love, and nothing makes me happier than walking into like a used bookstore with a really good vintage mystery section. I love to see the different covers, and I love to see, and to see what's there, if there's anything I haven't heard of or read. And I love that. So I just like to put that in my books because it's something that I like in my life. And I like it in books as well. Like I like to be specific about that stuff. I think sometimes I read a book and there'll be like, the character will go home and watch a movie, eat dinner, and then get into bed and read their book. And I want to know what all those things are. I don't need the full details, but for character purposes, I like to know, like, well, what movie did they watch? What did they eat for dinner? And what exactly is the book they're reading? So for me, I always like that in books. So I make sure that, I tend to get specific. If someone's reading a book in my book, I pick that specific book. And if it has a little clue to the story that you're reading, all the better.
Absolutely. You wanted to mention Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys Bobbsey twin books. You've left out my favorite, The Motor Girls of New England, which had one of my favorite lines of all time because my mother had a copy of it. Scorching along. This is written in like 1920, and it's a group of young women who drive sporty cars. And the line is, scorching along at 22, they blew a shoe. which I always absolutely loved. I mean, the speed scorching along at 22, and of course the shoe was a tire, but I've always thought that was such a poetic little line in what was popular.
Were they part of that? What was the name of the syndicate that did the Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys?
Oh, it was the Helen, whatever her name was. She had a giant tribute at Patrick. You saved me again at the Edgars one time. She wrote, I can't even remember. There was a syndicate, and then Helen Strohmeyer, I think her name was the Nancy Drew author, and there was another guy. Frank Dixon is the name that that they use, but they would actually bring in multiple authors to.
Yeah, there were like all these people at a typewriter.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. And then you go on to mention Enid Blyton. I love that. 5 on a Treasure Island. So, and even Peter Pan is in here. So it's very, very eclectic and lots of fun. And I had some great idea I was going to ask Peter, and now I got distracted. So. Patrick, it's time to join us while I try to think of what it was I was going to say. No doubt something absolutely brilliant that's escaped me. Do you remember? It was the Strohmeyer Syndicate. Isn't that what it was called? I think
Stratemeyer.
So. Stratemeyer. Thank you. I was close. Right. And they hired people, but for Nancy Drew, I think there was one person who wrote the vast
majority. Mildred Wirt Benson was the first one, but then they hired a bunch of people after that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So did she write like the first 10 or 20 or something?
Yes. Yeah. Well, she wrote the first 7. And then somebody named Walter Carrig wrote the next group. But then she came back with a vengeance, Mildred Wirt Benson, and then she wrote 11 through 25.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, the first 7, there were some, I think, they've changed over there, but those were quite good. I mean, talk about great. I wonder if the kids still read them. I know that there's new modern versions of them, but there was something, I grew up in a gendered household, and my sister got the Nancy Drews and I got the Hardy Boys, but I would, as soon as my sister was done with the Nancy Drew, I would grab it and read it. So I read both.
I've now remembered what it was I was going to point out, which is that during the pandemic, because I do the restock reports every week for the store, actually sometimes every day in reorder, that classics, Golden Age era and other classics have been turning over at a remarkable rate, people discovering all of these books. And while my husband and I have Poison Pen Press, we brought the British Library Crime Classics, which is a huge collection of Golden Age mysteries edited by Martin Edwards.
Martin. Yeah.
Right, back. And then my husband was inspired to ask the Library of Congress if they would like to do the Library of Congress Crime Classics, because it's our national library in the way that the British Library is the British National Library. And so they came on board, and now we've produced, I can't remember, something like 10 or 12 Library of Congress Crime Classics. And then the Horror Writers of America decided they would join in, and they call it the Haunted Library. And they are bringing back classics in the Gothic and horror range. And we have a big classics department now in the store, don't we, Patrick?
We do. Yep.
And it really turns over remarkably well. So
it does.
Yeah, I've really been pleased that the pandemic has slowed down life for an awful lot of people who have then rediscovered the joy of reading, but also have realized that there's a lot that they missed. Either they're too young or just never got around to it, or whatever you might want to call it. Have you read any of the British Library Crime Classics?
I'm pretty sure I did. I read the Lake District one, partly because I was going there, and I'm trying to think.
Well, that's actually Martin in modern era, because I edited those books all with him, and there's a new one coming out in July. But I'm talking about the British Library ones with the fabulous travel posters on the cover.
I think you're talking about the John Bood, right?
That's the one I read.
Yeah, that's an old one, Barbara.
And actually, your publisher, because Collins was Agatha Christie's original publisher before it was called HarperCollins, it was called Collins. They had a Collins Crime Club, and they have been republishing many books from their vaults. I mean, they've always kept like Sayers and Christie in print, but they have brought back a number of writers from the Golden Age in what they call Collins Crime Classic editions. They're small hardcovers. They're like $12 or $14 or something. So they've gotten in on it. And Penguin has actually brought some out too. And St. Martin's has a library of them. So a lot of publishers are working hard to bring back.
Otto's done a bunch too. Otto has that line that he's doing too.
Yeah, the American Mystery Classics. In fact, he has a new one coming out in April, a Perry Mason. Yeah, and the Library of Congress is bringing out, I'm blanking on the name, but one of the first Black authors who was successful. They're bringing back his first book, The Conjure Man Dies, I think is the name of it. Yep. So, I think it's great. And actually, Peter, it makes it more fun when your books are referenced because more people now will actually know who you're talking about because of all this kind of renaissance of classics. So you can even have more fun populating your books with books that you like.
Yeah, definitely. That interest in those bringing back new editions of older books, I love. My publisher in the UK is Faber, and they brought back a book by Celia Fremlin called The Hours Before Dawn. That was an Edgar winner, I think, in like the late 50s or early 60s. And then she got kind of forgotten. I think she wrote like eight or nine books. But I read in Galley, Hours Before Dawn, which is, I think one of the reasons they brought it back was it was very similar to this sort of domestic suspense that's suddenly taken off again. It's about a new mom in London, sort of in the post-war years, who they take in a lodger because they need the extra money, and she begins to believe that the lodger is there to kill her and to take her husband away from her. But she's also not getting any sleep because the baby has colic, and she doesn't know. So it's, again, you don't know, like, is she imagining it all, or is this lodger really evil? And it's a really, really good book. And it was so much fun. I mean, I know my publisher loved putting it out in this like great new edition. But I love that stuff when you bring back an old book that's kind of been forgotten.
Kind of an early Sophie Hannah kind of a book in many ways. Actually, one of the best British Library republications is a book called The Spoilt Kill by Mary Kelly. And it won the Gold Dagger and beat out John le Carré.
Oh, really?
And then, yep, back in, I don't remember when, but back in maybe the 60s or something. And then I don't remember, she never wrote another book or whatever, but imagine beating Jean le Carré and winning the Gold Dagger, which is the highest prize that Britain offers for crime, and then basically disappearing and being, out of print and forgotten for 50 years or more.
Is the book good? Did you reread
it? Very good. I loved it. Yeah. And I've given it to various authors and we've all been pushing it. It's set up in the pottery, the potteries up in Northern England. It's
Stoke-on-Trent or something like that.
Yeah. It's called The Spoilt, Spoilt Kill.
All right.
By Mary Kelly. But I mean, I think it's a terrific book. And I love the fact that some of these, like the Celia Fremlin or the Mary Kelly books that were really terrific in their day and then just for various reasons disappeared, are now coming back and for a whole new generation of readers to like. So, I mean, they become historical because it's set, in whatever, I think it was the 50s or 60s that it wrote. So today it feels more like an historical crime than a contemporary crime. But
that's what I love about reading books from 50, 60 years ago is, they can have a great story, but they're also these little, like, it's like you're peering back in time and you're seeing sort of what the world looked like from a contemporary author. And, it's just really interesting to get that kind of view. I mean, it's the same thing with watching an old movie, which I love. You're given a little sort of historical view of the time period.
Well, the needle keeps moving forward about what's in historical. When I opened the store in 1989, people barely thought the 1920s was an historical. I mean, it was almost like it had to be pre-World War I to be thought of as historical fiction. And now that it's 2022, the 1960s are becoming historical fiction. So, it's always going to move in that direction.
It's like classic rock. when you flip onto the classic rock station and you first hear this like REM or something that I love as a kid, I'm like, wait a minute, does that mean I'm old? And by the way, it does. But yeah, same thing.
Well, you're not quite old enough, but I will tell you that one of the most interesting things about aging is to recognize that your life has become history. You know, that you have become history. It's very unnerving. Anyway, Patrick, do we have questions from the audience, or would you like to chime in here and say anything?
Let's see. Fred, who's watching on YouTube, he says, how soon after completing a novel do you start the next book? Do you have an idea or ideas of what your next book will be about while you're in the process of completing a book?
I do. I mean, it's a little different on on each book. So I don't always do that, but I have in the past finished a book and then gone sort of, you know, within like a couple weeks onto my next one. I usually give myself a little bit of a break. And often, like the last 2 chapters of my work in progress, I kind of know at this point, I know exactly what's going to happen in those last 2 chapters. So it's just kind of a matter of transcribing it down. And I'm no longer sort of hunting for the plot in my mind. So at that point, I'm often already thinking of the plot for the next one, because that's always kind of going through my head. That's how I build a book, is I daydream about it and then start writing it. So in the past, I have started a book quite soon after I finished the other one. I'm not quite, we're doing lots of literary stories, but this is fun. I think it was Anthony Trollope who would write for the 2 hours before he went to work in the morning. If he finished a novel at 1 hour and 50 minutes, he would put it aside, put in a new piece of paper and spend 10 minutes on his next novel. Yeah, that's how he did it. But I don't do that.
That's very true. He worked for the post office, and so he would get up every morning and write before he went to work. He produced an enormous amount of work while constantly being employed, not as an author.
He also he created the iconic like postal box or something. He designed it. Yeah, he was a Renaissance man. But yeah, he would instantly start his next one like that morning. He wouldn't even give himself, you know, the next hour off. So yeah, I don't do that. I usually and I often try and write a short story or 2 in between books, because I find that's a good change of pace. Well, you know, I get to keep writing, but I'm, you know, not in the middle of a novel. It seems like a good time to do that.
Let's see here. Okay. Sherry would like to know, she has a question about the names of your characters. How do you come up with them?
I mean, it depends on the name. If it's a very important name, like the main character in my story, I'll give it some thought. Try and pick a name I like, that might have some meaning to the story, some symbolic meaning, that might feel, and also would feel right for the character. You know, where they come from, what their parents were like, because I've thought a lot about that character. But as a writer, you have all these other names that you have to come up with, which are just minor characters that maybe appear for one scene and disappear, and they often need like a full name. That I use a variety of things. So I used to have a baby name book that I would flip through. Nowadays, you can just kind of Google names. Sometimes I'll just think of like, where's this person from? So if it's a character from Maine, you can just simply put in, you know, popular boys' names in Maine, and you get this like long list, and you'll be like, something will jump out at you. But then the funny thing that I do sometimes is I'm not going to move my computer around because it'll make everyone dizzy. But I have 2 movie posters, one here, which is Charade, the Cary Grant, and then Murder, She Said over here, which is the Agatha Christie one with Margaret Rutherford. And they're loaded with names because, you know, below the image, there's this list of everyone who worked on the film. So I often find myself, because I'm writing here, I often find myself just look over here and I quickly grab a name. Like I'll grab one first name from over here and one last name. So I think there's a book that has just about every name that was on the current poster that was in front of me. So that's one way I do it.
That's great. Let's see here. Okay, yeah, Susan just has a question. What books are currently on your bedside table? What are you reading now?
I'm reading again, reading the past. I'm reading a Ruth Rendell book that I haven't read. She's one of my favorites, but I haven't read all of her books. And it's an Inspector Wexford. If you know her, she kind of alternated between police procedurals with Inspector Wexford and then more psychological thrillers. Although they mix, there's psychological stuff in the Inspector ones as well. And then I have a couple galleys that or a couple new books I'm excited to get to. One is Kelly Garrett's new book, Like a Sister, which I just got a hold of, that I've heard is good. And one is a debut, Don't Know Tough, a sort of a football, high school football kind of Friday nights lights meets murder mystery.
Oh, is that the Ely Craner book?
Yeah.
Yeah, from Soho. It's a debut, and for some reason or other, I never got an advanced reading copy of it, or if I did, I might have given it to Patrick, or anyway, we let it fall through the cracks, which I'm really annoyed about.
I talked to him. He's done a few little interviews similar to yours, much shorter, and he seemed like a nice guy. And the book sounded interesting to me, like a good setting for a different type of story. So I'm curious about that one.
If you'd send me your comments, since I don't have one, I'd really like to know, because it may still be possible for us to do something for him, because we really like to try to highlight every new author if we can.
I remember
Todd Goldberg.
That was amazing.
Yeah, Todd was talking about him last night, about how much he liked that book.
Well, I don't know. I don't know whether I blew it or whether somehow or other they didn't get. The problem I have, Peter, is if I don't get a copy to read, I tend to, I overlook it because other people's reviews don't matter that much to me. Yeah. And sometimes one just doesn't show up.
Right. Do you read, do you only read galleys, or will you read digitally?
I don't read digitally because I can't remember a thing, but I read, I print out, my husband, not I, prints out PDFs for me.
Yeah, I won't read digital. I mean, I can't read on a laptop or my
problem is that I have an eidetic memory, but it doesn't work unless it's printed in a page. I mean, I can go back, for example, your book, I knew where it was, when I was reading that passage. And if it's digital, it's just like a scroll, and I can't find anything. So my mind.
Oh, that's so interesting. Oh, wow.
I can't help it. But anyway, people send me galleys or PDFs. Sometimes very casually. I got a new John Grisham 2 years ago. I said, I'd really like to read it because we're going to talk to him. And they said, sure, here it is. And I thought, well, I could talk to John Grisham, or I could sell this for probably $25,000. So you have to be trustworthy before they will do that.
Of course.
But so far, we've been really good. Neither Patrick nor I has gone onto eBay or some auction site with anything that they've sent us early.
I have to hit up Juliet for a copy.
Yeah, well, I feel really badly about it. I hate missing a new book of merit. So maybe Peter will save us and tell us what he thinks, and then we'll go from there.
It's on my bedside table, as I say.
Nope, that's about it. That's about all the questions we have.
So Peter, I have one more thing. Since as a natural non-corporate plays poorly with others, I know that you did a couple, well, it's just who we are. You did a couple of events with multiple bookstores and all, and that doesn't seem to work well for us. But did you get any questions that you thought were really worth just repeating that we have not covered?
Oh, you're asking me to, so you have this great memory. I, for whatever reason, after doing events, can't remember what I talk about. But so I did one last night, and I did get, and I got some questions. I get the question now that, which is interesting because it's, suddenly I'm 8 books in, right? So I've sort of the middle of this career. So people often kind of want to know if I have a favorite, which is a tricky question to answer. lately I say sort of 8 Perfect Murders, just because I think there's an autobiographical element to that book, which is about reading. There's a lot about reading in that novel, and a lot of that comes just from myself. So I often pick that one, but it is weird to pick a favorite book because I think they're all, you know, they're all important to me, and they were a year of my life for each one. But that's a question I get. So lately, when I get that question, I generally say 8 Perfect Murders is my sort of favorite novel because of the main character, Malcolm Kershaw, and my favorite villainous character is Lily Kintner from Kindworth Killing.
Or you could say that my favorite book is the one I'm currently working on because it still has the possibility of being perfect.
That's interesting that you said that, because I've thought that too, which is, you're right. That's and it's the book that's on my mind, right? It's the book I'm living in right now, which is the book you're never talking about because it's just up in your head. So you're right. That's the perfect book.
Actually, when we first started the store, I think we did like our third author event, and I recognized that the author sitting up there in front of a number of people had a deer in the headlights look, because the author was talking about a book that he'd largely forgotten because he was like 1 or 2 books down the road. And I thought, the kindest thing I could do would be to get up, because I've just read it, I can remember it, and talk to him about it. And so I did, and we've gone on that way ever since. Patrick is a brilliant interviewer. Karen on our staff, John Charles of Army, we have a number of us, but all of our events are conversations because we recognize how difficult it is for an author to talk about a book when the author is immersed in a new book. And sometimes it's been maybe 2 years on the road to publication. And by then, it's kind of like you downloaded it in favor of something else.
It's true. And I think some authors, not everyone does this, but kind of let go of a book mentally after it's done. Partly it's because you've read it so much and you're sick of it. But it's also like, I'm someone who, once it's out in the world, once it's out of my hands, I'm done with it. And I let it go. I tend to be able to remember enough to talk about it, but yeah, there's this sort of, it's out of my hands, it's in the world. There's nothing more I can do with this book, except for talk about it. But I do stop thinking about it in that sense.
When we were doing more live events, and happily we're coming back to, I can remember many an occasion where someone in the audience would ask the author a question, and the author would look like, did I say that? Or that's not what I meant. Or, where did you get that interpretation? Patrick, you've read into that often too. What do you do when you prepare for talking to an author? What's your approach?
Oh man, you're asking for secrets.
Well, you're so good at it.
A lot of BS and bluff. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. It's funny. I come up with, there are obviously questions that apply to all authors, but usually my questions come out of, I try to read the book as closely as I can. And I always start from the book. And then, but another thing is I try to think about, all right, so what would somebody watching, what would they be curious about? There's a dangerous, sometimes it's easy to go too much, especially if you have a relationship with the author. If you're friends going way back, it can be a fine line between getting, we're buddies and talking a little about that versus talking to the audience, what the audience would like to know. And sometimes it's hard to, manage that fine line. But each one's different. Everybody's different.
Well, it is. And Zoom is a different conversation than when you have a live audience and you're trying to manage people and you're trying to worry about the signing line and all. So we've had some really wonderful conversations that we probably never would have had if, this pandemic hadn't come along and presented us with this whole new way to go about things.
Absolutely.
It'll be interesting to see how it goes going forward. Peter, thank you for your time. Let me wish you a very happy St. Patrick's Day. Everybody watching, the same. 9 Lives, wonderful book, and our copies will be with us probably at the end of next week. So we really thank Peter for signing them for us. And I want to thank his hardworking publicist who saved me from screwing up the time tonight. Thank you, Bianca. And for HarperCollins for letting us make an exception and do an interview with Peter all by ourselves, which has just been great. I hope next year you'll come see us.
Oh, I would love to come back. So
Well, we'll
Sounds
work
great.
out something because we've only had you, I think, once at the store, haven't we?
just once, yes. And
Yeah, so that's not good. Out of 8 books, we have to do better. So we will. Anyway,
Sounds
good
good.
night, everybody. Thank you so